Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the Bodega Cat Book Club Financial Edition. And today we're going to continue our reading of The Creature from Jekyll Island. Oops, sorry about the glare. By G. Edward Griffin. Okay, so we are going to continue with chapter 12. And let's see here. This will be part 2. 44. Okay. Just trying to get my bearings here. And I'm going to move the camera in just a little bit so you guys can see. Oops, sorry. If you have a book, you can follow with us there. If not, you can follow with us here on Zoom, or you could just listen, whichever way works for you. All right. Okay. Selling war to the American people. Through secret agreements and trickery, America had been committed to war, but the political and monetary scientists realized that something still had to be done to change public sentiment. How could that be accomplished? Wall Street control over important segments of the media was considerable. George Wheeler tells us, around this time, the Morgan firm was choosing the top executives for the old and troubled Harper and Brothers publishing house. In the newspaper field, Piedmont Morgan at this period, was in effective control of the New York Sun, the Boston News Bureau, Barron's Magazine, and the Wall Street Journal. And that quote was from George Wheeler, Pierpont, okay, Pierpont Morgan, and friends. A little tongue twister there, a little too early in the morning. The Anatomy of a Myth, Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, Prentice Hall, 1973, page 283 to 284. On February 19th, wow, I think I need a second cup of coffee here. Um, okay. On February 9th, 1917, Representative Callaway from Texas took the floor of Congress and provided further insight. He said, in March 1915, the J.P. Morgan interests, the steel, shipbuilding, and powder interests, and their subsidiary organizations got together 12 men high up in the newspaper world and employed them to select the most influential newspapers in the United States and sufficient number of them to control generally the policy of the daily press. They found it was only necessary to purchase the control of 25 of the greatest papers. An agreement was reached. The policy of the papers was bought to be paid for by the month. An editor was furnished for each paper to properly supervise and edit information regarding the questions of preparedness, militarism, financial policies, and other things of national and international nature considered vital to the interests of the purchasers. And that quote was from Congressional Record, Volume 54, February 9, 1917, page, wow, 2,947. Charles S. Mellon of the New Haven Railroad testified before Congress that his Morgan-owned railroad had over 1,000 New England newspaper editors on the payroll, costing about $400,000 annually. The railroad also held almost a $500,000 in bonds issued by the Boston Herald. And that piece of information was from Lundberg, page 257. A $400,000 quote payroll in 1915 was equal to $4.4 million today. This web of control was multiplied by hundreds of additional companies, which also were controlled by Morgan and other banking houses. In addition, the Morgan Trust exercised media control by its power of advertising. Writing in 1937, Lundberg says more advertising is controlled by the J.P. Morgan junta than by any single financial group, a factor which immediately gives banking house the respectful attention of all alert independent publishers. And that quote was from Lundberg, page 252. Morgan's control over the media at that time is well documented, but he was by no means alone in this. During the 1912 hearings held by the Senate Privileges and Elections Committee, it was revealed that Representative Joseph Sibley from Pennsylvania was acting as a funnel for Rockefeller money to various cooperative congressmen. A letter was introduced to the committee written by Sibley in 1905 and John D. Archbold, the man at Rockefeller Standard Oil Company who provided the money. In that letter, Sibley said, "An efficient literary bureau is needed, not for a day or a crisis, but a permanent, healthy control of the Associated Press and kindred avenues. It will cost money, but will be the cheapest in the end." And that quote was from IBIT, page 97 and 249. Lambert comments further. So far as can be learned, the Rockefellers have given up their old policy of owning newspapers and magazines outright, relying now upon the publications of all camps to serve their best interests in return for the vast volume of petroleum and allied advertising under Rockefeller control. After the JP Morgan block, the Rockefellers have the most advertising of any group to dispose of. And when advertising alone is not sufficient to ensure the fealty of a newspaper, the Rockefeller companies have been known to make direct payments in return for a friendly editorial attitude. So they're bribing the newspapers. IBIT, page 247. It is not surprising, therefore, that a large part of the nation's press, particularly in the East, began to editorially denounce Germany. The cry spread across the land to take up arms against, quote, the enemy of Western civilization. Editors became eloquent on the patriotic duty of all Americans to defend world democracy. Massive, quote, preparedness demonstrations and parades were organized, but it was not enough. In spite of this massive sales campaign, the American people still were not buying. Polls conducted at the time showed popular sentiment continuing to run 10 to 1 in favor of staying out of Europe's war. Clearly, what was needed was something both drastic and dramatic to change public opinion. I think maybe that's how they came up with all the false flags. Because, American peoples are smart, I think. They know what's right and what's wrong, what sounds fishy and what's not. Morgan control over shipping. Banking was not the only business in which Morgan had a strong financial interest. Using his control over the nation's railroads as financial leverage, he had created an international shipping trust, which included Germany's two largest lines plus one of the two in England, the White Star Lines. Morgan had attempted in 1902 to take over the remaining British line, the Cunard Company, but was blocked by the British Admiralty, which wanted to keep Cunard out of foreign control so her ships could be pressed into military service if necessary in time of war. The Lusitania and the Mauretania were built by Cunard and became major competitors of the Morgan cartel. It is an interesting footnote of history, therefore, that from the Morgan perspective, the Lusitania was quite dispensable. I think if I remember correctly, Lusitania was the sister ship of the Titanic. And it's been rumored that this Lusitania was the one that sunk, not the Titanic. Anyways, interesting theory. I wasn't there, so I wouldn't know. Ron Chernow explains, Pierpont assembled a plan for the American-owned shipping trust that would transpose his quote, community of interest principle, cooperation among competitors in a given industry, to a global plane. He created the world's largest fleet under private ownership. An important architect of the shipping trust was Albert Ballon, whose Hamburg America steamship line, with hundreds of vessels, was the world, was the world's largest shipping company. I burped a little bit there. Pierpont had to contend with a single holdout, Britain's Cunard Line. After the Boer War, the Morgan Combine and Cunard, the Morgan Combine and Cunard exhausted each other in debilitating rate wars. And that was from Journal, page 100 to 101. As stated previously, Morgan had been retained as the official trade agent for Britain. He handled the purchasing of all war materials in the United States and coordinated their shipping as well. Following in the footsteps of the Rothschilds of centuries past, he quickly learned the profitable skills of wartime smuggling. Colin Simpson, author of the Lusitania, describes the operation. Throughout the period of America's neutrality, British servicemen in civilian clothes worked at Morgan's. This great banking combine rapidly established such a labyrinth network of false shippers, bank accounts, and all the paraphernalia of smuggling that although they fooled the Germans, there were also some very serious occasions when they flummoxed the Admiralty and Cunard, not to speak of the unfortunate passengers on the liners which carried the contraband. And that quote was from Colin Simpson, The Lusitania, Boston, Little Brown and Company, 1972, page 50. The Lusitania. The Lusitania was a British passenger liner that sailed regularly between Liverpool and New York. She was owned by the Cunard Company, which, as previously mentioned, was the only major ship line which was a competitor of the Morgan cartel. She left New York Harbor on May 1st, 1915, and was sunk by a German submarine off the coast of Ireland 6 days later. Of the 1,195 persons who lost their lives, 195 were Americans. It was this event, more than any other, that provided the advocates of war with a convincing platform for their views, and it became the turning point where Americans reluctantly began to accept, if not the necessity of war, at least its inevitability. The fact that Lusitania was a passenger ship is misleading. Although she was built as a luxury liner, her construction specifications were drawn up by the British Admiralty so that she could be converted, if necessary, into a ship of war. Everything from the horsepower of her engines and the shape of her hull to the placement of ammunition storage areas were, in fact, military designs. She was built specifically to carry 12 6-inch guns. The construction costs for these features were paid for by the British government. Even in times of peace, it was required that her crew include officers and seamen from the Royal Navy Reserve. Interesting that I'm reading military ship designs. I watched a movie yesterday. It's a Japanese movie about the Japanese Navy ships and their designs and all the politics that happen. Very interesting story. I'll if I find it again, I'll put it in the description box below. The movie was called The War of Archimedes. Archimedes. I don't know why they titled it that way. But anyways, it's in Japanese. It's a foreign film. In May of 1913, she was brought back into dry dock and outfitted with extra armor, revolving gun rings on her decks, and shell racks in the hold for ammunition. Handling elevators to lift the shells to the guns were also installed. 12 high explosive cannons were delivered to the dry dock. Excuse me. All this is a matter of public record at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, England. But whether the guns were actually installed at that time is still hotly debated. There is no evidence that they were. In any event, on September 17, Lusitania returned to sea ready for the rigors of war, and she was entered into the Admiralty Fleet Register not as a passenger liner, but an armed auxiliary cruiser. From then on, she was listed in Jane's fighting ships as an auxiliary cruiser, and in the British publication, the Naval Annual, as an armed merchantman. Merchantman. And that was from Simpson, page 17 to 28, and page 70. Part of the dry dock modification, excuse me, oh, I burped again. Part of the dry dock modification was to remove all the passenger accommodations in the lower deck to make room for more military cargo. Thus, the Lusitania became one of the most important carriers of war materials, including munitions, from the United States to England. On March 8, 1915, after several close calls with German submarines, the captain of the Lusitania turned in on his resignation. Turned in his resignation. Sorry. But allergies acting up a little today. He was willing to face the U-boats, he said, but he was no longer willing, quote, to carry the responsibility of mixing passengers with munitions or contrabands. Wow, that's a dangerous business, isn't it? If you have passengers on the ship and you kind of go into war, then the passengers have the potential of getting killed. Hmm. Wow, that's not a good idea. Anyways, that quote was from Simpson, page 87. Churchill sets a trap. From England's point of view, the handwriting on the wall was clear. Unless the United States could be brought into the war as her ally, she soon would have to sue for peace. The challenge was how to push Americans off their position of stubborn neutrality. How that was accomplished is one of the more controversial aspects of the war. It is inconceivable to many that English leaders might have deliberately plotted the destruction of one of their own vessels with the American citizens aboard, as a means of drawing the United States into the war as an ally. Surely, surely any such idea is merely German propaganda. Robert Ballard, writing in National Geographic, says, quote, within days of the sinking, German sympathizers in New York came up with a conspiracy theory. The British Admiralty, they said, had deliberately exposed Lusitania to harm, hoping she would be attacked and thus draw the U.S. into the war. And that quote was from Riddle of the Lusitania by Robert Ballard, National Geographic, April 1994, page 74. Let's take a closer look at this conspiracy theory. Winston Churchill, who was First Lord of the Admiralty at the time, said, there are many kinds of maneuvers in war. There are maneuvers in time, in diplomacy, in mechanics, in psychology, all of which are removed from the battlefield but react often decisively upon it. The maneuver which brings an ally into the field is as serviceable as that which wins a great battle. The maneuver which gains an important strategic point may be less valuable than that which placates or overawes a dangerous neutral. And that quote was from Winston Churchill, The World Crisis, New York, Scribner's Son, 1949, page 300. This appears on page 464 of the Barnes & Noble's 1993 reprint. The maneuver chosen by Churchill was particularly ruthless. Under what was called the cruiser rules, warships of both England and Germany gave the crews of unarmed enemy merchant ships a chance to take to the lifeboats before sinking them. But in October of 1914, Churchill issued orders that British merchant ships must no longer obey a U-boat order to halt and be searched. If they had armament, they were to engage the enemy. If they did not, they were to attempt to ram this up. The immediate result of this change was to force German U-boats to remain submerged for protection and to simply sink the ships without warning. Why would the British want to do such a stupid thing that would cost the lives of thousands of their own seamen? The answer is that it was not an act of stupidity, it was cold-blooded strategy. Churchill boasted, "The first British countermove made on my responsibility was to deter the Germans from surface attack. The submerged U-boat had to rely increasingly on underwater attack and thus ran the greater risk of mistaking neutral for British ships and of drowning neutral crews and thus embroiling Germany with other great powers." And that quote was from Churchill, page 274, 275. To increase the likelihood of accidentally sinking a ship from a neutral great power, quote, great power, Churchill ordered British ships to remove their names from their hulls, and when in port to fly the flag of a neutral power, preferably that of the United States. As further provocation, the British Navy was ordered to treat captured U-boat crew members not as prisoners of war, but as felons. Quote, "Survivors," wrote Churchill, "should be taken prisoner or shot, whichever is the most convenient." And that quote was taken from the Diaries of Admiral Sir Herbert Richmond, February 27, 1915, National Maritime Museum, Greenwich, as quoted by Simpson, page 37. Other orders, which now are an embarrassing part of the official Navy archives, were even more ruthless. In all actions, quote, "in all actions, white flags should be fired upon with promptitude." Wow. Even people who surrenders, they're going to be shot upon. That quote was from PROADM. I don't know what that means. Maybe ADM is Admiralty, something. 116/1359, December 23rd, 1914, quoted by Simpson, page 37. The trap was carefully laid. The German Navy was goaded into a position of shoot first and ask questions later. And under those conditions, it was inevitable that American lives would be lost. A floating munitions depot. After many years of investigation, it is now possible to identify the cargo that was loaded aboard the Lusitania on her last voyage. It included 600 tons of pyroxylene, commonly called gun cotton, 6 million rounds of ammunition, 1,248 cases of shrapnel shells, which may not have included explosive charges, plus an unknown quantity of munitions that completely filled the holes on the lowest deck and the trunkways and passageways of F deck. In addition, there were many tons of, quote, cheese, lard, furs, and other items which were shown later to be falsely labeled. What they were is not now known. What they were is not now known, but it is certain they were at least contraband, if not outright weapons of war. They were all consigned through the J.P. Morgan Company, but none of this was suspected by the public, least of all those hapless Americans who unknowingly booked a passage to death for themselves and their families as human decoys in a global game of high finance and low politics. The German embassy in Washington was well aware of the nature of the cargo being loaded aboard the Lusitania and filed a formal complaint to the United States government because almost all of it was in direct violation of international neutrality treaties. The response was a flat denial of any knowledge of such cargo. Seeing that the Wilson administration was tacitly approving the shipment, the German embassy made one final effort to avert disaster. It placed an ad in 50 East Coast newspapers, including those in New York City, warning Americans not to take passage on the Lusitania. The ad was prepaid and requested to be placed on the paper's travel page a full week before the sailing date. It read as follows: Notice, travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies and Great Britain and her allies, that the zone of war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles, that, in accordance with formal notice given by the Imperial German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or of any of her allies are liable to destruction in those waters, and that travelers sailing in the war zone on ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk. Imperial German Embassy, Washington, D.C., April 22nd, 1915. Although the ad was in the hands of newspapers in time for the requested deadline, the State Department intervened, and raising the specter of possible libel suits frightened the publishers into not printing it without prior clearance from the State Department attorneys. Of the 50 newspapers, only the Des Moines Register carried the ad on the requested date. What happened next is described by Simpson. George Viereck, who was the editor of a German-owned newspaper at that time and who had placed the ads on behalf of the embassy, spent April 26 asking the State Department why his advertisement had not been published. Eventually, he managed to obtain an interview with the Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, and pointed out to him that on all but one of her maritime voyages, the Lusitania had carried munitions. He produced copies of her supplementary manifests, which were open to public inspection at the collector's office. More important, he informed Bryan no fewer than 6 million rounds of ammunition were due to be shipped on the Lusitania the following Friday and could be seen at that moment being loaded on Pier 54. Bryan picked up the telephone and cleared the publication of the advertisement. He promised Viereck that he would endeavor to persuade the president publicly to warn Americans not to travel. No such warning was issued by the president, and there can be no doubt that President Wilson was told of the character of the cargo destined for the Lusitania. He did nothing, but was to concede on the day he was told of her sinking that his foreknowledge had given him many sleepless hours. That was from Simpson, page 97. That was a man riddled with guilt, having a knowledge of something but did not act on it, act against his conscience, right? It is probably true that Wilson was a pacifist at heart, but it is equally certain that he was not entirely the master of his own destiny. He was a transplanted college professor from the ivy-covered walls of Princeton, an internationalist at heart who dreamed of helping to create a world government and to usher in a millennium of peace. But he found himself surrounded by and dependent upon men of strong wills, astute political aptitudes, and powerful financial resources. Against these forces, he was all but powerless to act on his own. And there is good reason to believe that he inwardly suffered over many of the events in which he was compelled to participate. We shall leave it to others to moralize about a man who, by his deliberate refusal to warn his countrymen of their mortal peril, sent 195 of them to their watery graves. We may wonder also about how such a man can commit the ultimate hypocrisy of condemning the Germans for this act and then doing everything possible to prevent American public from learning the truth. It would be surprising if the extent of his private remorse was not greater than merely a few sleepless hours. The final voyage. But we are getting slightly ahead of the story. While Morgan and Wilson were setting the deadly stage on the American side of the Atlantic, Churchill was playing his part on the European side. When the Lusitania left New York Harbor on May 1st, her orders were to rendezvous with a British destroyer, the Juno, just off the coast of Ireland, so she would have naval protection as she entered hostile waters. When the Lusitania reached the rendezvous point, however, she was alone, and the captain assumed they had missed each other in the fog. In truth, the Juno had been called out of the area at the last minute and ordered to return to Queenstown. And this was done with the full knowledge that the Lusitania was on a direct course into an area where a German submarine was known to be operating. To make matters worse, the Lusitania had been ordered to cut back on the use of coal, not because of shortages, but because it would be less expensive. Slow targets, of course, are much easier to hit. Yet she was required to shut down one of her four boilers and consequently was now entering submarine infested waters at only 75% of her potential speed. As the Lusitania drew closer to hostile waters, almost everyone knew she was in grave danger. Newspapers in London were alive with the story of German warnings and recent sinkings. In the map room of the British Admiralty, Churchill watched the play unfold and coldly called the shots. Small discs marked the places where two ships had been torpedoed the day before. A circle indicated the area within the U-boat within which the U-boat must still be operating. A larger disk represented the Lusitania traveling at 19 knots directly into the circle. Yet nothing was done to help her. Admiral Coke at Queenstown was given perfunctory instructions to protect her as best he could, but he had no means to do so. And in fact, no one even bothered to notify the captain of the Lusitania that the rendezvous with the Juno had been canceled. One of the officers present in the High Command map room on the fateful day was Commander Joseph Kenworthy, who previously had been called upon by Churchill to submit a paper on what would be the political results of an ocean liner being sunk with American passengers aboard. He left the room in disgust at the cynicism of his superiors. In 1927, in his book, The Freedom of the Seas, he wrote without further comment, the Lusitania was sent at considerably reduced speed into an area where a U-boat was known to be waiting and with her escorts withdrawn. Further comment is not included. And that quote was from Joseph M. Kenworthy and George Young, The Freedom of the Seas, New York Air Company, 1929, page 211. Colonel House was in England at that time, and on the day of the sinking was scheduled to have an audience with King George V. He was accompanied by Sir Edward Grey, and on the way, Sir Edward asked him, "What will America do if the Germans sink an ocean liner with American passengers on board?" As recorded in House's diaries, he replied, "I told him if this were done, a flame of indignation would sweep America, which would in itself probably carry us into the war." And that quote was from Seymour, Volume 1, page 432. Once at Buckingham Palace, King George also brought up the subject and was even more specific about the possible target. He asked, suppose they should sink the Lusitania with American passengers on board, ... That was from IBIT, page 432. A mighty explosion, a watery grave. 4 hours after this conversation, the black smoke of the Lusitania was spotted on the horizon through the periscope of the German submarine U-20. The ship came directly toward the U-boat, allowing it to full throttle out of her path and swing around for a 90-degree shot at her bow as she passed only 750 yards away. The torpedo struck 9 feet below the waterline on the starboard side, slightly forward of the bridge. A second torpedo was ready, but not needed. Quickly after the explosion of the impact, there was a second and much larger explosion that literally blew the side off the cargo hold number two and started the great ship immediately toward the bottom. And what a hole it must have been. The Lusitania, one of the largest ships ever built, sunk in less than 18 minutes. Wow, that's incredible. Survivors among the crew who were working in the boiler rooms during the attack have attested that the boilers did not blow at that time. Simpson tells us the G torpedo had failed to blow in the inner bulkhead of number one boiler room, but just further forward, something blew out most of the bottom of the bow of the ship or bow of the ship. It may have been the Bethlehem Company's 3-inch shells, the 6 million rounds of rifle ammunition, or the highly dubious contents of the bales of furs or the small 40-pound boxes of cheese. Divers who have been down to the wreck unanimously testify that the bow was blasted by a massive internal explosion, and large pieces of the bow plating, buckled from the inside, are to be found some distance from the hull. And that quote was from Simpson, page 157. When a search team from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute surveyed the wreckage in 1993, they reported, when our camera swept across the hole, we got a big surprise. There was no hole. We found no evidence that U-20's torpedo had detonated an explosion, undermining one theory of why the liner sank. That quote was from Ballard Riddle of the Lusitania, page 74 and 76. It is difficult to share the team's surprise. Photographs show that the wreck is resting on its starboard, which is the right side. Since that is where the torpedo struck, it is logical that the hole would not be visible. It would be on the side buried in the ocean floor. Failure to see the hole does not undermine the theory of internal explosion. It is exactly what one would expect. In any event, it is obvious that the Lusitania would not have gone to the bottom in 18 minutes without a hole somewhere. Hmm, maybe it's an inside job? I don't know. Even the search team had to acknowledge that fact indirectly when it addressed the question of what might have caused the second explosion. In an effort to avoid giving support to a quote conspiracy theory, the report concluded that the explosion probably was caused not by munitions but by coal dust. The controversy over the ship's cargo was finally resolved in 2008 when divers moved inside the Lusitania's hull and found millions of rounds of military ammunition. Sam Greenhill, writing for Mail Online, reported, divers have revealed a dark secret about the cargo carried by the Lusitania on its final journey in May 1915. Munitions they found in the hold suggest that the Germans have been right all along in claiming the ship was carrying war materials and was a legitimate military target. The diving team estimates that around 4 million rounds of U.S. manufactured Remington .303 bullets lie in the Lusitania's hold at a depth of 300 feet. And that quote was from Secret of the Lusitania. Arms find challenges, Allied claims it was solely a passenger ship by Sam Greenhill. Mail Online, December 20th, 2008, posted to internet. And we will stop there for today. Boy, that sounds like something that came out of a Hollywood movie. I think there were several movies that were made about U-boats and World War II and things like that. But anyways, I can't recall any of them right now, but I'm sure there's a lot out there. So we will continue next week. And in the meantime, I hope you guys all have a great day and a great weekend. We'll see you next time. Bye bye now.